Okay, welcome all. Shall we move on to the next slide? I just wanted to welcome everybody. Over here at the Corwin building, you've got Stephanie Tressé, that's me speaking. I'm Senior Marketing Manager. We've got Amanda Boudrias, one of our other panelists. And in the back end, we've got Kim Schmidt. We wanted to, find out who you are as well. So, my apologies, I'm having some technical issues. If you can just go ahead and use the option for now and tell us who you are as a teacher, a district level administrator, school level administrator, please do so. Thank you. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce Debbie. Debbie Zakarian is known nationally for her work in advancing student achievement, policies, programming, and professional development with schools and higher education institutions with culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse populations. She's a popular and frequent speaker at national and international conferences of major education organizations, including the National Title I Association, ASCD, and for those of you lucky enough to have seen her this past week at TESOL, also TESOL, as well as state conferences throughout the U.S. Debbie consults with state agencies, school districts, and colleges throughout the country and is an author consultant for Corwin Press. She's also the founder and president of Debbie Zakarian, EDD and Associates. These accessible explanations of the most current research into practical instructional school climate and parent engagement strategies, as well as strengths-based teacher evaluation systems, are widely practiced by teachers and administrators. She'll be helping us during this session and talking about all of that. Sorry. So Debbie, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie, and welcome everyone. I want to give a special shout out to Stephanie, Jill, and Kimmy and the Corwin community for making this webinar happen. And obviously, welcome everyone. And I'm going to be as excited to hear from you as is Stephanie to hear about where everyone is from. I know when Stephanie and I spoke earlier today, we have people from all over the country, which is really wonderful, and it's great to share this conversation with you. So the title of the talk is Unleashing the Power of Academic Language, and to get it started, along with welcoming you, what I'd like to do is have us look backward to think forward about a couple of agenda items that we've listed, both in the webinar that you received as well as here. And what we're going to be talking about are students who carry academic language and students who are learning academic language while they're attending school, which I'll get to initially. And then we're going to be talking about using an asset-based model of instruction, school climate, and family engagement that draws from students' strengths and assets, as well as families too. And finally, we're going to be using a four-pronged tool that I developed for advancing student achievement and engagement, as well as for advancing family-school partnerships, a very needed and important activity. So to get us started, we're using the chat feature so we can make this as engaging as possible. And what would be great is if you have a quick look at data from 2010, 2011 about our nation's U.S. public and public charter school students. And an important question for us all to ask ourselves is, does this data reflect or not reflect our schools or our districts where we work? So what Stephanie is going to be popping up in the chat box is just with a show of, I suppose, clicking a button, what's your largest student population? And in our nation, if we look at this, during the academic year 2010-2011, we saw that 52% of our nation's students are white, 48%, which is a very significant number, are from low-income families, which is identified by students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. 24% are from Hispanic or Latino populations, 16% from African American Black populations, 13% students with disabilities, 13% English learners. Asian and Pacific Islanders make up 5% of American public schools, and 1% are American or Alaskan and Indigenous Americans. So it's helpful to know who we all are and what is our largest student population group. And I guess to get us started, Stephanie, are you collecting this data?
Yeah, and we've got the majority, looks like low income. We're still getting some data now. Some folks are still answering. Give them a few more minutes, or not a few more minutes.
So now that we're having you all get familiar with these poll questions, we have another poll we want you to take. So, Stephanie, is this a good time to do the next poll, or would you rather we waited a minute or two?
Let's go ahead and do the next one.
Okay. So have a look at this poll as well. And this is different than American public school students. This is data about our country and its population. It's from the U.S. Census Bureau. It's data that was collected during the decade between 2000 and 2010. And it's about our nation's growth patterns. So what's growing in our nation? And a big question we should be asking is, have you noticed similar growth in your school or district? And use the chat box to share a quick yes or no response. So if we look at this from sort of the bottom up, during the 10-year period, our nation's population of white people grew by 6%. Its total population grew by 10%. And from there, we go up very quickly. Our African-American population grew by 12%. American Indian and Alaskan Native or Indigenous Americans grew by 18%. Other races by 24%. Two or more races by 32%. And our Hispanic, Latino, as well as Asian population both grew by 43%. So an important question to ask is this similar, is this type of growth the growth that we're seeing in our schools? So we're asking if you've seen growth like that in your own schools or your own district. So these are facts and figures that are collected both by our nation and by the U.S. Department of Education to really try and capture the changes or the changing demographics that are occurring. So it's important for us to think about what else is important to know as we seek solutions for our students. And many people, including me, have written extensively about teaching students from underserved populations. And these include students living in poverty, students from multicultural, multiracial, and multilingual contexts, and more. And their contributions are made much more relevant by the significant increase that we're seeing in racial, ethnic, economic, and linguistic diversity against the backdrop of teachers and educational leaders, specialists, and others involved in this sort of global rubric that we call educators, or global umbrella we call educators. And this group of us who are educators, we've remained relatively the same. That is, most educators are white and middle class. So an important step for all of us, regardless of where we sit in terms of our country, is to understand the historical context. In other words, think backward to look forward about unleashing the power of academic language. And to do that, what's helpful is to sort of look at sort of the laws and regulations that are based on some of the grounding principles and grounding laws that govern our country, and many of them are based on inequities and poor outcomes. So let's have a little look backward to think forward about this. And if we do, while Stephanie's collecting this polling data, if we look back to the 1960s, in which I've got a graphic depiction of President Johnson, the year that he launched what he called his war on poverty, and also began the civil rights movement. This began in the 1960s. It was a mass protest against racial segregation and discrimination. It involved many Supreme Court cases, and it was also the time that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was implemented. So that act has been around for over half a century, and it's one that it governs all of what we do in public and public charter schools in terms of the rights of students to have equal access and an equitable education. So in the 90s, under President Clinton, a new movement began, and that was known as the charter school movement. And while it began with several 100,000 students, it's had many more that have enrolled in charter schools, and many of you may come from a charter school in your own area. In 2001, under President Bush, we had the No Child Left Behind Act, reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. In 2009, we had the Race to the Top, and we still do, grant initiative under President Obama. And most recently in 2010, many states, and probably many that represent those of us who are attending, became engaged in what's known as the Common Core State Standards, an initiative led by our state's governors and the chief state school officers. So if we look at all of these initiatives that encompass over a 60-year period, all of them have had language around helping our students have equal access to a quality education. But what's equally important as we look backward is to look at what are our graduation rates. And if we look at this fairly closely, what we see is that graduation rates, according to many, are on the rebound, meaning students are doing better. But if we look at this slide that as it first appeared in Education Week in 2011, we see the time period between 1999 and 2008, in which while it states that graduation rates are on the rebound, we can easily see that there are many groups of students who are no longer or are not graduating at a level that we would say is really rebounding. In fact, if we look at the graphic, there are certain groups of students who are doing quite well or well, and other groups who are doing significantly poorly. And if we look at our states, and what I did in preparation for this webinar is I looked at 5 states to look at their graduation rates. And what we see is very similar to what's presented at the national level. However, it's broken down by different groups. And have a look at California, for example. And what you see in California are that Asian and Asian Pacific Islander students are graduating at a fairly high level, whereas students with disabilities, English learners, and others are graduating at a much lower percentage. The same holds true for Massachusetts, the state that I'm from. It looks almost identical to the California profile, as does Illinois, as does South Carolina. And if Stephanie and I gathered all the data of what states you're representing, it's likely that your state would likely look like these 5, or what the national data has to say about students who are graduating high school and those who aren't. So it does bode the question, what's critical to consider to improve the educational outcomes of our nation's students? And in considering this, while the Common Core hasn't been in effect long enough to really know if it's going to have a significant impact, at a fundamental level, certain groups of students continue to do poorly and reflect the urgent need to understand and consider what's needed to advance student achievement for everyone. And from the perspective of this talk, Unleashing the Power of Academic Language, it's really important to take a closer look at language and literacy, especially the type that's needed to perform successfully in school, as it's an important key for unlocking the achievement gap. So let's look at it a little bit more closely. And to do this, in order to sort of have a better understanding of academic language, or what's needed to be a successful learner in school, what I welcome you're doing is reading the following excerpt. And when you're done reading it, take less than a minute to see if you can grab a piece of paper and expand the conversation on this topic. Now, the excerpt is 2 sentences long. It's 2 quick sentences. And see what you can jot down on your own to extend the conversation on this topic, okay? Here it is. So I'll give us about a minute to sort of see what we can do with these 2 short sentences in terms of extending the conversation. Okay, it's been just a little under a minute, and I hope that you have a lot that you've written down. And in a certain sense, if we think about this short passage, what we have to think about is what would we need to have in order to be able to add a sentence to this passage right here. And one of the things we have to think about is we have to possess the following, and that is we have to have deep social and cultural knowledge of chemical engineering, because that's a passage about chemical engineering. And we also have to have the ability to listen, speak, read, and write in chemical engineering language. We have to have pretty deep academic knowledge in chemical engineering, and we have to be able to think in chemical engineering in order to be able to communicate in chemical engineering. So if we think of these two sentences in this excerpt of computer engineering, we have to possess quite a bit. And in terms of teaching, students have to master the same type of academic language across all subject matters. So I'm going to show you some sample items and performance tasks that are intended to help our nation, teachers, administrators, and policymakers who are implementing the Common Core State Standards and preparing for what the Smarter Balance Group calls next generation assessment. So let's have a look at some of the elementary questions that are being, sample questions. So what is going to pop up on your screen is an example of an elementary school English language arts literacy example. And as I read it to you, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Last night I learned that my grandma was named after Babe Ruth, the greatest baseball player of all time. I learned this 6 hours too late. Yesterday I wanted to work on throwing a baseball. I needed a baseball since my brother wouldn't let me borrow his. Unfortunately, I knew where one was. I tiptoed into my grandma's bedroom. Sunlight from the late pouring morning sun filtered in through the leaves of the dogwood tree outside the open window. I moved slowly through my favorite room in the house, which belonged to my favorite person in the world, my grandma. And the story continues. And at the end of the story, students will be writing an essay or writing a short answer in the space provided on the right. And what it asks is, what does Naomi learn about Grandma Ruth? And they must use details from the text to support their answers. So if we think about this, the type of language that students need to answer this particular type of text is in a certain sense the same type of language that's required of us in the computer engineering example. And another way of looking at it too is the math example, which is right here. And here it is. 5 swimmers compete in a 50-meter race. The finish time for each swimmer is shown in the video, and hopefully everyone, or we all understand that video. And we, as elementary school students, should explain how the results of the race would change if the race used a clock that rounded to the nearest tenth. So if we look at this in terms of what is being asked of us, we have to possess the same type of knowledge that was required in that earlier excerpt, or that is students need to. That is, they need deep social and cultural knowledge. Students who certainly would know who Babe Ruth is, what a dogwood tree is, all kinds of language that's listed in that earlier example. And the same with the math example. Students need a deep level of knowledge. They have to have the ability to listen, speak, read, and write in those particular English language arts and mathematics examples. They certainly have to have academic knowledge in order to complete the tasks asked of them. And they have to be able to think in that language in order to be able to communicate those important answers. In a certain sense, this is what academic language is. It is academic language learning is a sociocultural, developmental, academic, and cognitive or thinking to learn process. It is akin, what I call it's akin to the prongs of a four-pronged electric outlet, where each prong is essential for the power to turn on. In terms of these 4 prongs, each prong is essential for learning to occur. Now, if we look at the federal definition of academic language, an interesting definition is what the federal government uses to define what it means to be proficient in English. And if we read this definition, it almost is the same definition as what's required of all students. The only difference in item 2, where I put the 2 dots, is that the language of instruction is English. But in all other cases, the ability to meet the state's proficient level of achievement on state assessments, the ability to successfully achieve in classrooms, and the opportunity to participate fully in society is what we might define as the characteristics of academic language. So before moving forward to our discussion about this academic language, I want to ask Stephanie about the poll that she took earlier. Stephanie, do you have any results from the 2 polls that we took?
I do, and so for the largest student population, primarily a lot of folks selected low income. And for have you noticed similar growth in your school or district, it splits as that double the people saying yes than the folks who said no. Does that make sense? Probably is not using very good academic language right there.
Okay, wonderful. Well, it's not that I read a lot of the research, and this is what the research says, is that almost half of our nation's students are living in poverty, and the diversity that we're seeing is something that's that is occurring across our nation. So whether we're from the East Coast, West Coast, Northwest, wherever we're from, South, Central, we're experiencing this. So it's helpful to kind of think about academic language in terms of what I call a literacy framework. And what I want to talk about next is how to look at this. In other words, what is how does all this relate in terms of the students who we teach? So on your left, I'm going to talk about the student Thomas, and on your right, the student Lily. And in the book that I wrote about this is how I pose it as well. There are these 2 students. Each of them have a lot in common. They're both 5 years old. They're both in Mrs. Fielding's kindergarten class, so they're both from the same community. And for the purpose of this discussion, what I want to talk about is Thomas is the student that I name as Carrie's academic language. And I'm going to tell you more about Thomas in a few seconds. I want to state that Lily is what I call an academic language learner. So we have these 2 students, both of whom have the wonderful opportunity to come to school, and they're both excited to be in school. And let's talk about, and their parents are as well, so let's talk a little bit about Thomas and what I mean by he's carrying academic language, as well as Lily. And I'm drawing from large bodies of research to talk about this, and most notably Mary Govain and Barbara Rogoff, both very well-known psychologists who talk about child development and some of the differences between among our students. So Thomas, here he is carrying academic language. What does that mean? In a certain sense, what it means is it's likely that his parents are typically more educated, more formally educated, and that their parenting is geared so that he'll develop literacy skills. In fact, when they take him to the local aquarium and Thomas sees big and little fish, one of his parents might ask him, Thomas, which fish do you think eats more food, the big fish or the little fish? And that type of open-ended question requires Thomas to think and engage in the same types of activities that he'll be engaging in school. In fact, their parenting is very geared for him to develop literacy skills. And it isn't just that they ask him questions, he also witnesses or observes them engaging in a lot of literacy behaviors. He watches his parents poring over recipe books, reading the newspaper, using the computer to type, writing notes, bringing grocery lists to the store. So in other words, he's really engaging in this kind of apprenticeship into literacy. The other is they act as coaches. As opposed to telling him directly what to do, a common way that they behave is to give him an implied directive, or what I call a veiled directive. His mom or dad might say, Thomas, it's 5 o'clock. And that means, in a certain sense, that's a signal or a direct, not request, but an order for him to stop doing what he's doing, get up, go over to the bathroom, wash his hands, and come to the dinner table. In fact, Thomas's parents are very time-centric, and U.S. dominant culture as well as Western European culture, according to many who study culture, is very time-centric. And in Thomas's family, and like today, most of us came to this webinar at the appointed time. They live by the clock. There are many sayings that they use to define time, such as time is money, time flies, beyond time, and stuff like that. And their goal really is for Thomas to think about this independently and develop adult-like independent thinking and problem-solving skills when he's young and when and forward. So let's talk about Lily. Lily is what I defined as an academic language learner, and this is how I define it in my writing as well. Her parents are typically, and again I'm drawing from these two seminal psychologists and others. Their parenting is typically, her parents are typically not as formally educated. Their parenting is not geared for her. Their parenting is wonderful, but it's not geared for Lily to develop school language and literacy skills. Rather, it's geared for her to understand her, being a full, wonderful member of her family and community. In fact, their parenting is very directive. When it's time for dinner, one of the parents may get up, go to get Lily, help her wash her hands and bring her to the dinner table. And being directive is part of their culture and part of their belief. And they're much less time-centric in favor of being much more relationship-oriented. And in research that's been done on individualistic cultures such as Thomas's versus collectivist cultures such as Lily, and collectivist cultures of which Lily represents, as do many, many cultures across the world, the focus of the culture is on relationships or being a member of a group, and how the group is far more important than its time. And their goal for Lily is that she'll think like an adult when she's an adult. So let's take another poll about the two students. And in this poll, which one do you believe would be more successful in school or in college, Thomas or Lily? So if you quickly answer that question, that would be great. And then we can go on to the next segment of our talk. So hopefully folks have filled that out, and Stephanie will give us the results as we go along. But let's go forward a little bit with this. And here's another poll question for us. And that is, which student do you think most educators represent? Are we more like Lily, or are we more like Thomas? In terms of our own experiences and expectations, do we represent mostly students like Thomas or mostly students like Lily? Okay? So a way of thinking about this as we fill this out, Stephanie, are we gathering some good data here?
For the first poll question, it looks like most people have responded Thomas.
Okay.
And we are just uploading the second poll question now.
Okay, so here that important question. Which one do you think most of us represent? Well, who do you think most of us represent? Are we like Thomas or are we like Lily? So without giving away the answer, I'm hoping that most of us are done clicking the box. And Stephanie, have we kind of finished with that clicking?
Yeah, we've got most people saying that they are like Thomas, but we've also got a handful of folks saying that they are more like Lily.
Okay, great. And when I have gone all over the country and given talks like this, that's exactly what I find. Most people say they're like Thomas, and some people say they're like Lily too. So here is something to think about, is as educators, regardless of our role, whether we're teachers, specialists, educational leaders, or other stakeholders, we covet academic language. I joke with people and say it practically oozes out of our skin. In fact, that's part of who we are. We really love literacy. We tend to use language in a variety of ways. And most of us, if not all of us, have advanced degrees in the field. So we went to college, we graduated, we got our teaching degree or more, and literacy is a way of being for us. At issue, though, is most of us haven't had much in the way of formal training with academic language learners. And so when thinking about the gap, some of the gap is really looking more closely at how much and how prepared are we to work with this wonderful population of learners. And a way of thinking about it is Thomas comes to school with these skills that I discussed earlier. And I refer to it in the book as a literacy suitcase, but Thomas carries these skills with him well before he comes to school, and they're like a literacy suitcase that he carries to, in, and from school wherever he goes. And Lily needs to learn these skills. So Lily needs the literacy suitcase as much as Thomas. And if we look at this in another way, and I'm drawing from a colleague, Ken Pransky, who was great in sharing this way of describing it, is Thomas carries academic language. And it's the same academic language that we use in school. Some of us call it school language. So what he uses on a regular basis matches what happens in school, and what we use matches what happens with Thomas. In a certain sense, and it doesn't matter what group Thomas is from. He may be living in poverty. He may be representative of different racial groups or a dominant group. If he carries academic language to, in, and from school, it's likely that he matches what we do in school. But an issue is if the student is like Lily or an academic language learner, we need to do quite a bit to create the match. And in looking at this, one of the ways I used to describe it is here's Thomas grown up. He's in high school, and teacher assigns a learning task, and Thomas has the great capacity to engage in the learning task successfully. In other words, we assign him a task, and he's able to engage in it independently pretty successfully. Lily, on the other hand, is an academic language learner. We assign her a learning task, and the ability that she has to engage in the learning task successfully means that we've got to scaffold some of the important characteristics or the important literacy culture that she needs in order to bring the two together so that she can do this independently. And that's, in a certain sense, the gap is what kinds of things should we be providing that really help Lily to carry academic language or carry this literacy suitcase as well and as strongly as Thomas. So the research tells us quite a bit, and we have quite a body of research to look at to really help us understand what's needed in order to help our changing student populations succeed and also close the achievement gap. The National Literacy Panel did a meta-analysis of available research in 2006, as did the CREE Group, or Center for Research on Equity and Diversity in Education. There's been a lot of research on parent engagement, and some of it I cite here. Also, we've got more recent ideas about what we should be using in terms of the data that we collect to make informed decisions, as well as teacher evaluation, which I've developed a self-reflection, coaching, and supervision rubric that really draws on our assets to strengthen what we're doing for this growing population. And in order to describe that, the research yields 4 important prongs about learning, this electric outlet that I talked about earlier, that learning is a sociocultural, developmental, academic learning, academic language learning is a sociocultural, developmental, academic, and cognitive or thinking to learn process. And the very first element that we have to think about is that many students represent these collectivist cultures, which are wonderful cultures and important for us to consider. And a way of considering them is how important it is to build strong relationships with our students and their families based on our personal understanding of their personal, cultural, and world experiences. When we do that, we're much better able, and we should connect learning to issues that are socially relevant. And an example of that I use in the book is if we want to build learning, we should be building it on issues that are socially relevant to our students' lives. And in this example of this picture, hopefully here in Massachusetts, we're getting ready for the spring. And in the spring, the snow melts and we have what's called vernal pools. And these vernal pools this pool looks pretty good, but it's across the street from the elementary school that was that sits in front of a big apartment complex. And in the kindergarten classroom, students were learning about the environment, and they would walk by this pond every day on their way to the kindergarten, except you're seeing the cleaned up version of the pond. What it used to look like is it was filled with trash, empty soda cans, empty beer cans, broken bicycles, and all kinds of things. And when the students were studying the environment and studying concepts of pollution, they told their teacher about how messy and trashed up the pond was. And the teacher decided for them to learn about the environment and learn about being scientists through their exploration of a cleanup campaign. And she enlisted the kindergarten students and their families, as well as the school community, to engage in a nice cleanup campaign of the vernal pool, which is what you're seeing, the cleaned up version. And so that issue was very socially relevant to a kindergarten. Many of the students lived in the apartment complex across the street, and they really relished the idea of being empowered to be involved in this cleanup campaign. And the teacher knew that it's very important to connect learning to issues that are socially relevant. The other is we have to understand that students learn best or learn very well from their peers, not just because group work is a wonderful method of method for us to use, but it reflects a cultural way of being for many of our students who come from the collectivist cultures that I described. So when we use parent and group work, it can be to our advantage, especially with students from the growing cultures across our nation. The other we have to think about in terms of creating strong family-school partnerships is that unfortunately many of the parent or family meetings that we have in school are generally academic engagements. So the first time a parent comes or a family member comes to enroll their child in school, it's usually an enrollment, and it's filled with lots of forms that families have to fill out. The second engagement may be an open house, where parents simply sit as passive learners to hear about their child's class day or instructional program. And then the third that typically occurs are parent-teacher conferences, in which parents pretty much listen to the teacher to learn how their child is as a student. And none of these really help parents engage in partnerships that are socially, that have a social element. So part of our understanding about relationships is also that we build engagement based on an understanding that if many of our students are coming from these collectivist cultures, as are their families, it's very important to create these social engagements where we build relationships. And the pictures that I'm showing are of a potluck supper, a curriculum night in which parents are invited to see their kids, share with them what they're learning. And the other example I have is from the National Writing Project that you can go out to the web and see yourselves on a unit that they did on American immigration. Those types of engagements are where students went out into the community and interviewed a family member or friend in pairs about their American immigration experience. So these elements are what make up the sociocultural prong. And what I'm going to ask you using the chat feature is use the idea, drawing from the ideas that I just discussed, write an idea that you might use in our work or in your work, drawing from the sociocultural prong, and write them here. And while you're doing that, I'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll go on to talk about literacy learning as a developmental process. Okay, so while you're writing, I want to move on to the second prong, which is literacy learning as a developmental process. And like Thomas and Lily, all of our students come to school with different stages of literacy. So we might think of Thomas as being near to the top of these stairs, and Lily somewhat at a different level. And if we look closely at this, research on the vocabulary gap, which is in a certain sense the literacy gap, there's a landmark longitudinal study that was led by Becca McCullen's work on robust vocabulary development, and there's this very large gap between students from professional experience, students whose families represent professional groups versus students whose families represent working class groups. And in this you can see that the words children by the ages of 0 and 3 heard were quite different in terms of the number of words heard and were exposed to. And the vocabulary level of students by age 3 is also quite distinct, where students from working class communities were heard to speak about 700 words, whereas students from professional families were heard to speak about 1,100 words. So we have to really look at literacy as this process that all students have the capacity to develop, but how can we help them develop it best? So most effectively. So one way of doing it is to look at literacy, or the second prong, as a process, a developmental process. And what I have up on the screen is a symbolic something written in another language, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So you're looking at this writing that someone did, that I also have in the book to talk about the process of literacy. And reading, which you're doing now, or looking at this, and perhaps some of us know what it says. Reading, like listening, speaking, and writing, is a developmental process, meaning we learn to read as a developmental process. And vocabulary and literacy are both built through repeated experiences. That is, if you looked at this and you know what it says, it means that your optic nerve transmitted a signal to the brain, what my colleague Ken calls squiggles on a page, that we gain meaning of this, whatever is written here, which I'll tell you in a minute, by repeated exposure and connection to what we see. We then process it at the word level, or the sound level, the word level, the sentence level, the chapter level, and more. And we also, very importantly, understand the author's intent in writing this. And equally important, we use our personal, our world, our cultural knowledge to make sense and meaning of what is in front of us. Now, some groups of students are reared in communities like Thomas, where they're mentored or coached into literacy from birth. But many students need these mentorships. To do this requires that we think of literacy as a cultural way of being and acting that many students must be apprenticed into. An important way for us to do this is to help our students learn how language is used in context. So if you'd like to know what the writing is here on the page, that is the Arabic word for hello or hi. But let's look at the following example. And Stephanie's going to give us another poll here, I believe. And here we've got another piece of written text. It says, Mary went flower picking. She picked 8 flowers. Each flower has 10 petals. How many petals are there altogether? So what subject matter does this question represent? And just jot down your answer to that question. And while you're jotting it down, Stephanie, we took an earlier poll. Did you have an opportunity, or do we have enough responses to share the answer?
Yep. So that's just kind of wrapping up this one poll. We're also at the 3:46 mark. Just wanted to say that. Let's post the response to Stephanie.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. What did you say?
We're at the 3:46 mark, and then you should be seeing the poll results now for the earlier question. Well, I don't see it on my screen. So.
Did many people write another sentence to that? If they did, they know a lot about computer engineering, and I don't. So that's great. But did anyone write an extension sentence to that computer engineering passage?
So it looks like you can go in there, but it's not quite sending. Give me a second.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go on here. We talked about Mary flower picking, and hopefully people will say that it's a math problem, because we know that that is how math is written. Indeed, if we look at any course text, there are always key terms, words, idioms, and phrases, what I call SWIFTs, and I use this acronym in another book, that rely on our understanding of the author's intent. So in this earlier example, Mary went flower picking. She picked 8 flowers. Each flower has 10 petals. We know that the author's intent is to write this as a math problem. And the subject matter that this question represents is indeed math. And like I said, any course text, we usually know that this is on a certain subject matter. So if we look at another example, mentoring students into how language is used in context and by subject matter is essential. For example, if our teacher had explained how math is represented, which is very important, and the student reads another math problem, like the one earlier from the Smarter Balance group, or this one here, where we see Matt bought 16 tickets at an amusement park. If the tilt-a-whirl ride costs 6 tickets, the Ferris wheel costs 10, the swing around costs 4 tickets, and the water slide costs 4 tickets, what is the maximum number of rides that Matt can take? We see this again as a math problem, or particularly written in a specific style that reflects it to be a mathematic question or a mathematic text. And indeed, every school text is its own indigenous way of speaking. So if we look at our texts in terms of how they're represented, and we can help our students unpack that, that is helping them mentor into school language. So think about the literacy prong and how you might infuse the ideas in your work. You can just jot down these ideas on your own, and hopefully some of the ideas I shared will be helpful to you. The next prong is learning as an academic process. And in order for us to look at that, we have to determine, and we're learning more about what the research says, is it's really important to determine what is essential for students to learn. And in addition to that, making it known and explicit to our learners, especially academic language learners. For example, a teacher who's engaging her students in a social studies unit about the time period of the Pilgrims. Here he's kind of looking over he's a middle school teacher, he's looking over his course text, and he wants to display a learning objective that's going to carry him throughout the unit of study and make it socially relevant for his students. So he forms this into a question that his students can see displayed on a whiteboard, in a handout, or a table mat on a daily basis, because he knows the research says that it's important to be quite explicit and help students see physically what the goal is. So he forms a question: why do people move from one place to another? And his students see that question, that essential question, all the time. And in terms of what students will do to learn, we also know that that's important to display as well. So the same teacher creates puts this up on the whiteboard and leaves this up throughout the unit of study. So an example of this is of what they're going to do. His students are going to create a poster describing 5 reasons that the Pilgrims came to the New World. And I took this photo from his whiteboard. The other is he knows the importance of graphically organized vocabulary. And like back in McCoon's study, what we know is that the more we can display for students visibly what we want them to learn, and in a way that makes the most meaning, it can really help organize learning and make it more explicit and known. So this teacher also organizes the language that he wants students to use into categories, and displays these so that the students can readily and regularly access the key vocabulary that he's teaching. And in this case, you can see what he's displayed. And importantly, we know the importance of practice opportunities. In fact, students spend more time out of school than they do in school, but we all struggle with homework, or especially with struggling learners. We always question whether or not we should assign students homework given their life circumstances outside school and whatever they're experiencing. And some of the things we might want to think about is if we think of homework as a practice opportunity of what was done in class, how can we make it more meaningful so that students might have a better opportunity and practice opportunity at home to do what they've learned in class? Now, Paul Nation is a scholar from Australia who talks about the volume of practice opportunities that we need. And he talks about learning a new language as for many students needing as many as 20 practice opportunities. And an important way of thinking about homework is if it involves the practice opportunity of what was done in class, how can we connect it to an issue that might be something that students can readily do at home, such as interviewing a family member or friend about the reasons why they moved from one place to another. Students could certainly do that in pairs to support the collectivist perspective I discussed earlier. And again, you can go out to the digital storytelling project that was done, and I cite that in the book, as well as many, many other examples, both elementary, middle, and high school, of what kinds of things students can do outside of class to really help provide these wonderful practice opportunities. And assessment should be the same type of thing. Students should be assessed on what they've studied and done in class, not on what they haven't done. So that's an important element around the academic prong, and one that I discuss greatly in the book. The task that we'd like you to think about is think about the academic prong and one idea that you think you might add to your work. And in thinking about that, the fourth prong is learning as a cognitive process, or how we support our students to think to learn. And all of us are familiar, or many of us are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, but what's important about this taxonomy is how we help students engage in the think tasks that are associated with it. For example, if our teacher wanted his students to perform at the lowest or the earliest side of the pyramid of Bloom's taxonomy, he might engage his students in some remembering facts, such as point to the Mayflower and so forth. If he wanted to engage students at a higher level, he might engage them in analyzing. But whatever he does, the important thing is that he teaches them the skill, specifically what does it mean to investigate or debate and analyze, and earlier, what does it mean to remember by listing, locating, and finding and pointing. The other is that we have to think about how we graphically display it, and that we use the same graphic organizers or ways of displaying it so that students, especially those who go from their regular classroom to a specialist teacher and so forth, see the same types of things. So here's an example of a student who goes from one classroom to another, and one teacher might use one graphic organizer to list 5 reasons why people move from one place to another, and another teacher might use another. So it's important for us to come to agreement about the types of organizers that we use. So of course, think about the cognitive prong and an idea that you might try. And then finally, what we want to discuss in this webinar is why it's important to understand making data-driven decisions as a solo or group process. And our last poll is one in which we'd like you to take where you can tell us whether you usually make decisions about your instruction and engaging families on your own, as a collaborative process, or a combination of both. So while you're filling that out, what I want to share with you is that most coaching and supervision practices across the country are using rating categories that have a lot of what I use the term of negative language. So in this case, it's the New York rating categories for teacher and principal evaluation. And if you look at the bottom category, what it lists is that teachers at sort of this category are ineffective, and the language used to describe what teachers are doing is results well below state average, results well below and does not meet standards. And if you go up a level to developing, we again see that kind of language, results below and needs improvement. It doesn't really give teachers enough of an asset-based language, especially teachers, the vast majority of us, who haven't had training to work with these new and emerging populations about what to do. So here we see the results of our our survey, which is most of us do this in combination with others. We tend to make decisions with others. So what I've done in this book is create an observation chart that's based on the 4 prongs, in which we can gather data about which stage of professional development we are. It uses asset-based language of emerging, developing, enacting, and integrating. And I'm showing you one small example from the sociocultural prong about the kinds of things we would want to look for to know what stage of professional development we're at. And then here's a specific example looking more specifically around how we build relationships with students. We can see that across this are some asset-based language, so a teacher who's at the emerging stage may be primarily focused on her subject matter or his subject matter or curriculum, whereas teachers at a higher stage of professional development, there's more language around how they're building relationships. And it's very helpful to use language like this to help us all scale up. So in the book, I provide these types of descriptors for all of the 4 prongs with various descriptors for each one. And they are labeled accordingly so that we can do this as an individual or group process and use specific language to help us scale up. So in closing, before we have a few questions, what I want to share with you is using these 4 prongs, provide us with a way to provide comprehensive solutions that make a difference in what we think and what we do so that all learners can use academic language and can acquire it and more successfully perform in school and beyond. And their families can be more actively engaged in the journey with us. So I'm going to turn this over to Stephanie, who's going to complete our webinar talk with us, and it's been a pleasure to work with you.
Thanks again, everybody, and Debbie, for your presentation. We did get a question about whether this information is in the book, and so the cover that you see here is the cover for the book, and we're offering 15% off at Corwin.com if you use the promo code, and that's available for the next month. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Debbie is also one of our office consultants, and if you're interested in having her at your district, you can call that number or go to that website. We are still taking some questions, although it seems like it appears that anybody has any questions right now. We'll wait for another minute, and we'll see if anybody else types in a question, but in the meantime, I do want to thank everyone for their time, especially Debbie. Okay, there don't appear to be any questions. Thank you again, Debbie, and thank you for all the participants. We will be providing the webinar as an archive on our website. You can just go to corwin.com/learning/webinars.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you so much, Corwin, for hosting this event, and I hope this talk was helpful for everyone.
Thanks again.